Sold by parents to a cruel alpha, the Omega's touch made him freeze and refuse to let go. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Elena Whitmore stood perfectly still as the final signature dried, the scratch of pen on parchment louder than the winter wind outside the stone walls, louder than her own heartbeat, louder than the truth she had already accepted hours ago, that her parents' hands had not trembled when they agreed to the price placed on her life. The room smelled of cold iron and cedar smoke, a place built for authority, not comfort, and Elena felt small within it, her boots barely scuffing the flagstones as she was guided forward like a detail already decided. She did not cry, not because she was strong, but because tears had learned there was no place left to land. Her mother avoided her eyes, focusing instead on the seal pressed into the wax, while her father cleared his throat as if the sound could smooth over the choice he had made, and Elena watched the way his shoulders loosened once the deal was done, as though a burden had been lifted from him and placed squarely onto her. Dominic Blackwood did not rise from his seat when she was presented, and that alone told her everything she needed to know about the man she now belonged to. He was stillness shaped into human form, tall and unmoving, his presence filling the chamber without effort, his gaze calm in a way that made people careful, the way one becomes careful near deep water. Stories said he was cruel, not loud or wild, but precise, a man who kept his world in order by never letting himself hesitate, and as his eyes passed over Elena, she felt the weight of being assessed without malice or mercy, like a fact placed on a ledger. A clerk spoke her name, her age, her rank, his voice neutral, practiced, and Elena realized that this was how history recorded people like her, not as daughters or dreams, but as lines read aloud and quickly forgotten. She was told to step closer, and she did, her posture straight, her hands folded, her breathing measured, because if this moment was inevitable, then she would not make it smaller by fear. Dominic's attention sharpened as she entered the space before him, not aggressive, simply focused, as if something in the air had shifted by a fraction, and for the first time she noticed the silence, how even the guards seemed to hold their breath, how the fire cracked once, and then settled. Elena felt the cold of the room recede as she stopped, close enough to sense warmth she had not expected, close enough to feel that this was no longer a transaction, but the edge of something else she could not yet name, and she waited, steady and quiet, for whatever command would come next. The room did not change once Elena stopped moving, but the way it felt did, as if the air itself had decided to pay closer attention. Dominic Blackwood rose at last, slow and deliberate, the chair barely making a sound against the stone floor, and the simple motion drew every eye without effort. He was taller up close, not imposing through force but through certainty, the kind that made people instinctively adjust their footing. Elena kept her gaze steady, not challenging, not lowered, simply present, and she sensed a flicker of something unreadable pass behind his calm expression. He circled her once, not like a predator, but like a man inspecting the edges of a decision he had already made, noting details others might miss, the way her shoulders remained relaxed, the way her breathing did not quicken, the way her sense stayed soft and unguarded instead of sharp with fear. To the onlookers, she was silent, obedient, exactly what had been purchased, but Dominic heard what silence revealed when it was chosen rather than forced. He stopped in front of her and spoke her name, Elena, testing its weight as if he were deciding whether it belonged in his world, and the sound of it in his voice carried no cruelty, only precision. He asked no questions about her family, no reassurances, no threats, because he did not need to, and because he did not believe in promises that were not enforced by action. Instead, he told her the rules, his voice even, each word placed carefully, that she would be given quarters within the inner wing, that she would be expected to follow the household schedule, that she would not leave the grounds without permission, and that disobedience would not be tolerated, not because he enjoyed control, but because disorder was something he had spent his life eliminating. Elena listened, absorbing each condition without flinching, and when he finished, she nodded once, acknowledging reality without resistance, a response that earned her a brief pause from him, the kind that meant she had said more by saying very little. The guards shifted, expecting dismissal, but Dominic raised a hand, halting them, his attention returning to Elena with a focus that made the space between them feel narrower. He studied her eyes, not searching for submission, but for weakness he could catalog and move past, and found instead a steadiness that did not demand kindness or provoke disdain. Somewhere deep within him, a memory stirred, not of softness, but of control slipping for the first time, of a moment long ago when stillness had been mistaken for safety. He dismissed the thought as irrelevant and turned away, issuing instructions for her escort, as if she were already part of the structure he ruled, not a stranger to be endured. As Elena followed the attendant through the corridor, the echo of her footsteps steady and unhurried, Dominic remained where he was, watching the space she had occupied as though something unseen lingered there. He told himself it was nothing more than the adjustment of a system incorporating a new element, that everything would settle into place as it always did. Yet when the door closed and the room returned to its earlier quiet, he realized his hand had tightened at his side without conscious command, fingers curling briefly before relaxing again. He frowned, not in anger, but in calculation, filing the sensation away as an anomaly to be observed, unaware that this small disruption, this unnoticed pause, marked the beginning of a balance he had never planned to question. Elena learned the rhythms of the fortress quickly, not because anyone explained them to her, but because survival had taught her how to listen to spaces and people long before she arrived there. The inner wing was quieter than the outer halls, its windows narrow, its corridors measured in deliberate steps, and she sensed that everything here existed to reinforce order rather than welcome comfort. Servants watched her with open curiosity and thinly veiled judgment, whispers trailing behind her like a second shadow, because an Omega who arrived through trade rather than tradition carried a different weight. She felt it most during the first formal meal, when Dominic's household gathered in the long dining chamber, polished wood reflecting the glow of low lamps, the scent of roasted herbs lingering in the air. Elena was placed at the far end of the table, close enough to be seen but distant enough to be dismissed, her chair slightly lower than the others, an unspoken reminder of her status. Conversation continued around her without pause, remarks about supply routes and alliances flowing easily, until one voice cut through with casual amusement, commenting that the Alpha's latest acquisition looked smaller than expected. A few quiet laughs followed, restrained but intentional, and Elena kept her gaze forward, her hands folded, her posture unchanged, because reacting would have given the moment more power than it deserved. Dominic did not look at her then, not immediately, and that absence felt deliberate, a silent allowance that told everyone he was aware and chose not to intervene. The message was clear, not cruel but sharp, that she was not here to be defended, only observed. Another remark followed, softer but closer, suggesting she had been fortunate to find a place at all, and Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not fear, but the steady ache of being reduced to a lesson for others. She breathed through it, reminding herself that dignity did not require permission. When Dominic finally spoke, it was not to silence the comments, but to redirect the discussion entirely, his tone even, the shift absolute, and the table followed his lead without hesitation, leaving the moment to fade as though it had never occurred. Elena noticed the way he took a sip of water afterward, the slight pause in his movement, the brief stillness that lingered before he resumed listening, and she wondered if he had felt it too, the subtle imbalance that followed her presence. Later, as she was escorted back through the halls, a pair of attendants murmured behind her, their words not meant for her ears but close enough to reach them, speculating on how long she would last, whether she would be sent away quietly or simply forgotten. Elena did not turn, did not slow, did not give them the satisfaction of acknowledgment, because she had already been forgotten once, and she knew the shape of that silence well. What she did not know was that from the upper balcony, Dominic watched the small procession pass below, his expression unreadable as he noted the way she walked without hesitation, how her shoulders remained level, how the quiet around her seemed to follow rather than swallow her. He told himself that this was what he expected, that endurance was common, that Omegas adapted because they had to. Yet something about her composure unsettled him, not because it challenged his authority, but because it existed entirely outside of it. As Elena disappeared from view, Dominic turned away, dismissing the lingering tension as an inefficiency of thought, unaware that the household had already begun to recalibrate around a presence that refused to shrink, even when given every reason to do so. The summons came without ceremony, delivered by a quiet knock and a single instruction to present herself in the central hall, and Elena knew from the stillness in the corridors that this was not a social call, but a recalibration. She walked the measured distance with the same steady pace she had learned to keep, counting the turns, the length of each passage, the subtle changes in sound beneath her boots, because knowing where she stood helped her decide how she would stand. The hall was larger than the dining chamber, its ceiling high, its windows tall and narrow, late afternoon lights stretching across the floor in pale bands, and Dominic Blackwood waited at the center as if the space had been built around him. He dismissed the attendants with a glance, the doors closing softly behind them, leaving an absence that felt intentional rather than empty. Elena stopped several feet away, exactly where custom would place her, and waited. Dominic regarded her in silence, not with the distant assessment of a ruler managing assets, but with a focus that felt closer, sharper, as though he were listening for something that did not announce itself. He did not begin with explanation or accusation, because he did not believe in preambles, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same, even control she had heard before, telling her to come closer. The words were not raised, not harsh, simply stated, and that made them heavier than an order barked across a room. Elena felt the pull of expectation settle, the invisible line drawn between obedience and hesitation, and she chose to move without rush, stepping forward until the distance narrowed to what he had intended. She stopped again, her posture unchanged, her hands still folded, her gaze level but respectful, and waited for whatever came next. Dominic noted the way she did not flinch when he shifted his weight, how her breathing remained steady, how she did not ask why, and he found that this absence of protest did not read as surrender, but as something more deliberate, a quiet acceptance that did not invite dominance. He told her the expectations that followed proximity, that when he called for her, she would answer, that when he spoke, she would listen, that there would be moments when her presence was required without explanation, not as punishment, but as necessity. Elena listened, absorbing the cadence of his voice, the precision of his phrasing, understanding that these were not threats but boundaries, and she acknowledged them with a nod that did not lower her head. The light shifted as clouds passed outside, the room dimming by degrees, and Dominic felt a familiar pressure build, the urge to reassert distance, to conclude the exchange and return to equilibrium, yet he did not dismiss her. Instead, he held the moment, watching her as though the answer he sought would appear if he waited long enough. Elena felt the scrutiny and did not retreat from it, because she had learned that shrinking invited more attention, not less, and she stood exactly as she was, present without challenge. When Dominic finally spoke again, it was to instruct her to remain, to stand where she was until he said otherwise, and then he turned away, moving a few steps as if to end the meeting, only to stop, his posture stilling in a way that felt different from before. He did not look back immediately, and in that pause, Elena sensed a tension she could not name, not fear, not anger, but the strain of something being tested without consent. She remained where she was, silent and composed, while Dominic stood with his back to her, the space between them charged with an order that had been given and a response that had unsettled him more than refusal ever could. Dominic did not turn at first, and the stillness stretched until Elena became acutely aware of her own heartbeat, not racing, not slow, simply present, a quiet metronome grounding her where she stood. When he finally faced her again, the light had shifted enough to soften the angles of the hall, and his expression carried a restraint she had not seen before, not uncertainty, but focus sharpened to a fine edge. He spoke her name once more, Elena, and the way he said it this time carried a different weight, less assessment and more acknowledgment, as if he were confirming a fact he could no longer ignore. He instructed her to raise her hand, not as a demand layered with dominance, but as a test framed in neutrality, explaining that certain bonds within his territory required verification through contact, a formality he had never questioned because it had never failed him. Elena lifted her hand without hesitation, palm open, fingers relaxed, her movements smooth and unhurried, offering neither challenge nor retreat. Dominic stepped closer, the space between them narrowing until the air itself seemed to hold its breath, and he reached out with the same deliberate control that governed every decision he made. When his fingers brushed her skin, the contact was brief, light, entirely proper, and yet the effect was immediate and undeniable. Dominic froze, not from shock, but from a sudden absence of motion, as though the signal to move had been interrupted mid-command. His breath caught, shallow and still, and for a fraction of a second, the hall seemed to tilt, not physically, but in the way his senses recalibrated around a single point of awareness. Warmth spread from the place where their skin met, not heat, not fire, but something steadier, grounding, as if a long-standing tension had been released without warning. Elena felt it too, the subtle shift, the quiet pull that did not demand anything from her, only recognition, and she instinctively tried to draw her hand back, not in fear, but in respect for a boundary she had not meant to cross. Dominic did not let go. His grip tightened just enough to register intention, not force, his hand steady but unmoving, and the refusal startled him as much as it startled her. He had not decided to hold on. His body had made the choice before his mind could intervene. The room felt smaller, the walls closer, the silence heavier, and Dominic became acutely aware of the absence of threat in her presence. The way his instincts, honed by years of control, did not rise to dominance, but settled into stillness instead. He searched for irritation, for the familiar edge of command, and found none, only an unfamiliar clarity that made release feel illogical. Elena met his gaze, her eyes calm, not pleading, not triumphant, simply waiting, and that quiet patience anchored him in a way no submission ever had. He realized, distantly, that he was standing completely still, his muscles locked not in readiness but in restraint, and the realization unsettled him more than any challenge could have. Slowly, deliberately, he exhaled, the sound controlled, measured, and loosened his grip just enough to acknowledge her autonomy, without fully releasing her hand. The connection lingered, a quiet hum beneath the surface of his awareness, and Dominic understood with unsettling certainty that this was not a reaction he could command away or dismiss as anomaly. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, steadier than he felt, instructing her to remain where she was, not as an order, but as an unspoken admission that he needed the moment to exist exactly as it was. Elena did not move, her hand still within his, her posture unchanged, and in that suspended instant, Dominic Blackwood realized that something within him had paused, attentive and unyielding, and that letting go was no longer a simple matter of will. Time resumed in small increments, measured not by movement but by awareness, and Dominic became conscious of the way Elena's pulse beat lightly beneath his fingers, steady and unhurried, as though her body trusted the moment more than his mind did. He should have released her hand immediately. He knew that, because control was maintained through clear actions, not pauses, yet his grip remained, not tightening further, not loosening enough to end the connection, suspended in a state that felt uncharacteristically unresolved. Elena sensed the hesitation and did not mistake it for danger. Instead, she allowed her hand to remain where it was, her shoulders relaxed, her stance grounded, offering no resistance and no invitation, only presence. The hall seemed to recede, its vastness reduced to the narrow space they occupied, and Dominic felt the unfamiliar pressure of attention turning inward, his instincts no longer scanning for threats, but circling the quiet certainty emanating from her. He searched for the urge to assert dominance, the reflex to re-establish hierarchy, and found it strangely absent, replaced by a calm that made force feel unnecessary and distance feel incorrect. His thumb shifted slightly against her skin, not a deliberate motion, but an unconscious adjustment, and the realization that his body was responding without command unsettled him more than the response itself. Elena inhaled softly, a controlled breath meant to steady herself rather than influence him. and the simple sound grounded the moment, reminding Dominic that she was not a symbol or a test, but a person standing exactly where he had told her to be. He became aware of how close she was, not in terms of proximity, but in the way her presence filled the space he usually kept clear, and for the first time in years, he did not feel the need to retreat from it. The silence stretched, heavy but not oppressive, and Dominic realized that the household beyond the doors would be listening for cues, waiting for signs of outcome, yet none came, because the moment refused to resolve itself into something easily categorized. Elena shifted her weight subtly, not pulling away, simply adjusting to remain comfortable, and the movement reminded him that holding her indefinitely was neither practical nor fair. Slowly, deliberately, he loosened his grip, releasing her hand with care rather than abruptness, as though the manner of release mattered as much as the contact itself. The absence of her warmth registered immediately, a quiet echo that lingered in his awareness, and he resisted the impulse to close the distance again, grounding himself in the discipline that had defined him for years. Elena lowered her hand without haste, returning it to its folded position, her composure unchanged, though her eyes held a new attentiveness, as if she, too, recognized that something unspoken had shifted. Dominic turned away, creating space between them, and for a moment he simply stood there, his back to her, recalibrating the boundaries he had never needed to question before. When he spoke, his voice carried the same measured control as always, instructing her to return to her quarters and await further notice, the words precise, unembellished, offering no explanation because he had none that would satisfy him yet. Elena acknowledged the instruction with a nod and moved toward the exit, her steps quiet, her pace steady, and Dominic listened to the sound until it faded, noting the absence of relief where he expected it to be. Alone again, he placed his hand against the cool stone of the wall, grounding himself in the familiar texture, and considered the undeniable truth that his instincts had not rejected her touch, but had responded by stilling, by refusing to let go until he consciously chose to do so. The realization settled heavily, not as fear, but as awareness, and Dominic understood that whatever this connection was, it would not be dismissed, ignored, or controlled through force, because it had already proven that it operated beyond his usual rules. Dominic did not summon Elena again that evening, and the absence of command unsettled him more than any defiance could have. He remained in his private study long after the fortress quieted, the fire reduced to embers, the stone walls holding the day's chill, and he found himself replaying the moment of contact with a precision he usually reserved for strategy. He examined it from every angle, searching for cause and explanation, yet the memory refused to be reduced to logic. It was not attraction as he understood it, not compliance, not submission, but a sense of rightness that had arrived without negotiation and remained without demand. He had spent years cultivating distance as a tool, believing that control depended on separation, that safety was maintained by keeping others at arm's length, and yet her presence had done the opposite, easing a tension he had not realized he carried. Across the fortress, Elena sat by the narrow window of her quarters, the night air cool against her skin, listening to the muted sounds of the household settling into sleep. She did not try to interpret the encounter beyond what it had been, because overthinking had never protected her before. What she knew was simple and steady, that when he held her hand, she had not felt fear, and in a world that had taught her to expect it, the absence mattered. She rose early the next morning, moving through her routine with quiet efficiency, aware of the glances that followed her in the corridors, the way whispers shifted when she passed, because something had changed and the household could feel it even if it could not name it. Dominic observed these subtle shifts from a distance, noting how conversations paused when she entered a room, how servants straightened without being told, how the atmosphere adjusted around her presence as if accommodating an unspoken rule. He told himself this was coincidence, the natural response to novelty, yet he found himself attentive in a way that went beyond management, tracking not her compliance but her well-being, noting whether she ate, whether she slept, whether the environment treated her with the quiet respect he expected from those under his authority. When a steward made a remark that skirted the edge of disrespect, Dominic intervened without raising his voice, redirecting the conversation with a look that left no doubt about his expectation, and the correction rippled outward, immediate and effective. He did not announce a change in status, did not issue proclamations, because he understood power best when it moved without spectacle. Elena noticed the difference in small ways, in the way space opened for her rather than closing, in the way instructions were delivered without condescension, and she accepted these shifts without comment, because acknowledgment might have turned them into something fragile. Later that day, Dominic stood at the edge of the training yard, observing from the shadows as Elena crossed the open ground alone, her posture composed, her pace unhurried, and he felt again that unfamiliar calm settle over him, a quiet assurance that did not ask him to be less than he was. He realized then that what unsettled him was not her effect on his control, but the fact that with her, control no longer felt like a shield he needed to hold up at all times. The recognition landed without drama, steady and undeniable, and Dominic accepted it with the same discipline he applied to every truth that mattered, understanding that the strength he had always trusted did not weaken in her presence, but softened into something more precise, more discerning. As Elena disappeared through the far gate, unaware of the decision forming behind her, Dominic stepped forward into the light, resolved not to retreat from what he had felt, because for the first time in years, stillness did not feel like restraint, but like safety, and that distinction changed everything. The announcement was made without flourish, a simple directive that the household assemble in the central hall before dusk, and the lack of explanation carried its own gravity. Elena arrived as instructed, her steps measured, her expression composed, aware of the curious glances that followed her through the corridors, aware that uncertainty sharpened attention more than spectacle ever could. The hall filled gradually, advisors taking their places, stewards standing at the edges, guards positioned with quiet precision, and when Dominic Blackwood entered, the low murmur faded into immediate silence. He did not take the raised dais at first, choosing instead to stand at floor level, close enough to be seen clearly, his posture relaxed but authoritative, signaling that this moment was intentional rather than reactive. His gaze moved through the assembled faces, assessing readiness, and then settled on Elena, who stood where she had been directed, visible and unhidden. He stepped forward and extended a hand, not as command, but as invitation framed in certainty, and after a brief pause that felt longer than it was, Elena placed her hand in his. The contact was steady, public, unmistakable, and the hall seemed to hold its breath as Dominic turned slightly, positioning her beside him rather than behind. He spoke then, his voice carrying without effort, addressing the room with the same calm authority that had built his rule, stating that Elena Whitmore was under his protection, that she was not to be referred to as property, commodity, or acquisition, and that any dealings concerning her would be conducted through him alone. He did not raise his voice, did not threaten consequences, because he did not need to, and the certainty of his words settled over the gathering like a boundary newly drawn. A ripple of reaction moved through the hall, surprise held in check by discipline, curiosity tempered by understanding, and Elena felt the shift immediately, the subtle recalibration of space and regard that followed his declaration. Dominic continued, clarifying that the agreement which had brought her here was concluded, that no claims upon her remained, and that from this moment forward, her presence in the fortress was by his choice and his responsibility. He did not frame it as benevolence or mercy, but as fact, and that distinction mattered, because it placed her within his world without diminishing her to a symbol. When he finished, he did not release her hand at once, allowing the silence to do its work, allowing the household to absorb what had changed, and in that quiet, Elena realized that for the first time since her arrival, she was not being discussed, evaluated, or judged, but acknowledged. Dominic inclined his head slightly toward her, a gesture subtle enough to go unnoticed by many, but deliberate all the same, and then he guided her toward the dais, positioning her beside him as he took his place, signaling inclusion without explanation. Questions were not invited, objections not entertained, and when he dismissed the assembly, it was with the same efficiency that governed all his decisions. The matter settled because he had settled it. As the hall emptied, the weight of attention lifted, replaced by a steadier awareness, and Elena found herself standing in the aftermath of a choice she had not been asked to make, but had been irrevocably shaped by. Dominic released her hand then, not abruptly, but with the same care he had learned to apply to moments that mattered, and he met her gaze briefly, his expression composed, his intent clear without words. She inclined her head in acknowledgment, not submission, and turned to leave as instructed, aware that the path before her had shifted in ways she could not yet fully see. Behind her, Dominic remained where he was, watching the household adapt around the new reality he had established, confident not because he had asserted power, but because he had recognized it, and chosen to stand by it in full view of everyone who mattered. The days that followed settled into a quieter rhythm, one that felt deliberate rather than imposed, and Elena noticed how the fortress adjusted around her presence with a subtlety that spoke of intention rather than spectacle. Doors opened without hesitation, instructions were given without edge, and when she walked the corridors, the silence that followed was no longer sharp with judgment, but calm with awareness. Dominic observed these changes without comment, because commentary was unnecessary when outcomes aligned with purpose, and he found that the order he valued did not fracture under this new balance, but refined itself. One evening, as the light faded beyond the narrow windows and the air cooled with the promise of night, he asked Elena to walk with him along the upper terrace, not as summons, but as request framed in certainty. They moved side by side, their steps unhurried, the stone beneath their feet holding. The warmth of the day, the distant forest stretching dark and endless beyond the walls. Dominic spoke first, not to explain his actions, but to state what mattered, telling her that what he offered was protection without possession, space without abandonment, and choice without pressure, because any bond worth keeping could not be enforced. Elena listened, her gaze forward, absorbing not just the words but the steadiness behind them, understanding that this was not an apology or a promise, but an acknowledgment of something already in motion. She told him, simply and honestly, that she did not know what her future held, that she had learned to live without certainty, but that she knew one thing clearly, that she no longer felt invisible, and that mattered more than she could easily express. Dominic accepted this without hesitation, because he recognized truth when it stood plainly before him, and he did not reach for her hand then, allowing the space between them to exist as its own form of respect. They stopped at the edge of the terrace, the world spread below them, quiet and vast, and for a moment they stood in shared silence, not because there was nothing left to say, but because nothing needed to be said to confirm what had already been decided. As Elena turned to leave, ready to return to her quarters, Dominic spoke once more, his voice low and steady, telling her that the world beyond these walls could be unforgiving, that attention often followed protection, and that if she ever felt the need to step away, he would not stand in her path. She met his gaze then, fully, and in her expression he saw resolve shaped by experience rather than fear, and she thanked him, not for safety alone, but for the choice to accept or refuse it. When she left him there, the night air settling around him, Dominic remained at the terrace edge, his thoughts uncharacteristically quiet, and he realized that the strength he had always trusted had not diminished, but had learned a new shape, one that did not rely on distance to endure. Below, Elena paused once before entering the corridor, placing a hand briefly against the stone wall, grounding herself in the reality of where she stood, aware that her life had shifted not through force or rescue, but through recognition. Neither of them knew exactly what the days ahead would demand, but both understood this truth with absolute clarity, that what had begun as a transaction had transformed into a choice, and that choice, freely acknowledged, carried a power no contract could ever command.